All right, and welcome to anatomy video number 1. So this is going to have an overview of all of the body systems, as well as looking at the planes of motion, basic bone and muscle structure, the major bones of the body, and we'll look at the joints and how those play into those planes of motion and our yoga poses. And we're going to start off by looking at the body systems. So we have the skeletal, cardiovascular, muscular, nervous, endocrine, digestive, urinary, lymphatic, respiratory, integumentary. So I'm going to show us this great little app that I have. It's called Human Anatomy Atlas. And this is going to be something we'll use throughout our anatomy to look at how the muscles move, but it also breaks it down into all of those different body systems. So we're going to start off with the skeleton. And we all know skeleton are bones. They're connected together at joints. And they use these ligaments. So you can see this lighter color. And that is going to hold the bones together. The muscle will use tendons to actually move the bones. So we'll just move on to, let's look at the cardiovascular system. So these are the blood vessels. So this is what's going to keep the muscle tissue healthy. The blood feeds it with all the energy that it needs, nutrients, oxygen, and then it takes away all the toxins, brings it to the lungs, and the air changes, fuels the blood again, and it goes and feeds the body. So great little system there, but just notice we have closer to the center of the body, much larger vessels, and then they come out tiny little capillaries where they switch over and then become veins that go back. So just notice that there are some spots where you can see some of those vessels are at some of the joints. So just being aware in some of the poses, maybe some of the seated poses or compressed poses, that we want to be mindful of circulation. Okay, moving on, we're going to look at the nervous system. So there we go. So this is the nerves. There's this innervation. The nerves run through the body, through the muscle, through the bone. So this infusion of the nerves is something, again, that we want to be mindful of. And I'm just going to flip this guy around because this is one I think that we'll notice a lot, the sciatic, and how it comes out through these lower parts, these sacral parts of the spine, and oftentimes can cause a lot of issues for people. And we use a lot of yoga poses to help create some release in those areas. And we'll look at those later in the training, but just keeping in mind that the nervous system is definitely something we want to think about when we are putting our poses together for a class. All right, the endocrine system. So that's just about hormones. Hormones are released in the blood, so the hormones will integrate with the cardiovascular system, and the hormones will control things like our blood pressure, heart rate. You'll notice there's some right up here at the throat, and then there's our adrenal glands. They sit on top of the kidneys. All right, so we'll turn that one off. I'm going to shift over to the muscles. You see the muscles are a little bit more external. These are what's going to move the body in all of the different ways. And we can see how they're in different directions, and some have different shapes. Some are wider at one end, some twist around. And we'll take a look over the next few modules of our anatomy to how those apply to the movements in the body. The tendons are these lighter parts, and they are the parts that are going to connect to the bone that it's either going to move or anchor against to create the movement. The digestive system. There we go. So with the digestive system, we have this peritoneum. It kind of holds everything together. So I'm going to hide that so we can just see some of the organs that are in play in the digestive system. These are going to remove the nutrients from the food. There's also, like up here in the liver, that's going to be not only helping digest the food, but it's also going to play a part in cleaning the blood, taking the toxins out of the body. Okay. Next, we'll just look at the urinary system. So very central in the abdominal area. The kidneys, they also help filter the blood and carry the toxins out through our urine. The lymphatic system. So you can see, I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see some of that a little bit better. So it also runs throughout the body. And you'll notice these little nodules, and those are going to be in certain areas. We've noticed that sometimes if we get sick, we'll have some little nodules or swelling in the armpits or up at the tonsils. And that is our immunity. Oh, I'm going to flip us around here. There we go. Okay. So that is part of our immune system, and those little nodules are reservoirs, and so when our body is fighting infection, those will swell because they fill up with the white blood cells. Okay, moving on to respiratory. So in our lungs, as I said, this is an important component of yoga because we use the breath a lot. There's a specific portion of yoga that's focused just on the breath, our pranayama practice, but also how it plays out in the rest of the body. This is what helps the blood get clean. So if we weren't breathing in the oxygen, we wouldn't be able to clean the blood and we would fill up with toxins. So breath, super important, along with everything else. And then finally, the integumentary system. And this is just the skin, and it is the largest organ of the body. And we also want to be mindful of that. I mean, that's what holds everything in. It keeps infection out of the body. But we want to also be mindful for some yoga poses. If we have students who have very fragile skin, how will that affect some of the poses? If you're going to be doing a lot of twisting poses or some that could cause friction on the skin. So all of the systems, we want to have some mindfulness about what they do in the body and how they might be affected in our yoga practice. So next we're going to look at planes of motion. So these are the different ways in which the body moves, and we can see here there's three. There's one that splits right down the middle. Anything moving along that plane is going to be flexion and extension. And if we look at this diagram, or this person standing here, it is the movement that would be happening in the way the joints are oriented in the way he's standing. So sagittal would be things like bicep curls, squats, running. Frontal is like splitting in front and back halves. And so any movement along that is going to be a frontal movement. So those are things like abduction, adduction, eversion, inversion of the foot or the ankle, lateral flexion. And those would be things like side steps or side lunges. And then pronation is, transverse is the twisting. So that's going to be things like pronation and supination, internal rotation, external rotation, things like moving the trunk, twisting it, rotation, bicycle crunches, lunges with rotation. All of those things are some of the regular exercises that you might see in those different planes of motion. But let's take a look. All right, so let's just take a look at how those different planes of motion work with our yoga poses. So we'll start off with sagittal. Remember, sagittal is our flexion and extension, okay? So not just in the arms or in the shoulders, but also in the spine, in the legs. So lots of different poses can incorporate our sagittal plane of motion. So let's think about extension, back bend, extension of the spine. I'm going to come down onto the floor and lay down on my belly. So some of our extensions lying on our bellies could be something like our cobra. We can take that in as tiny of a motion as what feels good in the spine. So protecting that lower back, we're going to press in through the pubic bone as if we're doing a little mini crunch, and then help lifting up, finding that cobra pose. You can also do this in our locust pose. And then moving into sagittal plane of flexion, taking it back into our child's pose. So we have some flexion here in the core, flexion in the knees, another flexion pose, turning the toes over and lifting the hips up and back. We have the flexion in the core, again at the hips, in our downward facing dog. Oftentimes those knees are nice and stiff to begin with, so we're going to have flexion in the knees when we first get people into their downward dog. Taking it forward, standing forward fold, Uttanasana, another flexion. And reaching up and finding that mountain pose. All right, so let's think about frontal plane of motion. What are some yoga poses that move in this direction? Anything that's moving, so maybe just the arms. So what kind of poses do we have where the arms are extended? Could be our five-pointed star. Could be our warrior two. Or any of these other types of poses that get into the core. So our extended side angle, stretching through the side body. I like to always do these on the other side. So if you're doing this with me, which I hope you are, join me on the other side. Okay. How about turning the toes out and stretching, finding our frontal plane of motion in this direction, our triangle pose. And remembering that we don't want rotation here. So we only want people to come down as far as they feel they can keep that nice long body and just lengthen through that frontal plane of motion. Let's do it on the other side. Doesn't need to be too deep, especially if we haven't moved around much. So there's some good frontal plane of motion, transverse. So we have different parts of the body that can be doing this transverse or spinning. So if we're thinking about our arms, we do external rotation of the arms as we lift them up into our extended mountain pose. So there's some transverse plane of motion there. We also have external rotation in the hip. So here's some transverse plane of motion in our hip for tree pose. Okay. So that's this motion here. And then how about in the spine? We can do our standing, our revolved triangle, or revolved crescent, revolved warrior, all of those standing revolved poses. But even coming down, I'm going to take us back down to the ground, finding a puppy stretch. Okay, so the thighs are straight up and down. And I'm going to do a little transverse motion in the spine by simply taking one arm and threading it underneath, keeping equal weight in both of my knees so that my hips stay squared, so I don't kilt off to the side, but I can find a nice deep twist through my spine and stretch in the shoulder. Take it over to the other side. Bones. Okay, so let's take a look at the structure of bones. We can see over on the right, this is a long bone, so it's going to have spongy bone in the center, and the smaller piece that's cut out and showing in the far right is showing how that structure is. And you can see the innervation there. There's nerves, there's blood vessels running through the inside of the bone. So there is research that shows weight-bearing exercise can help improve bone health. So in addition to things like calcium, vitamin D, we also need to have torque, pressure on the bones, weight resistance, to help the bone build back and create strength and density. So there was research done that showed a regular yoga practice can actually increase the density of bone mass in people who were diagnosed with osteoporosis. Some of those people were downgraded to osteopenia, which is kind of a pre-osteoporosis condition. This was a 2-year study. But it was a regular practice of yoga and just standard yoga poses that they practiced every day. So we can think about it's not always just lifting weights, but we can use the way that we hold the poses and push the body and put torque and pressure into the bones to help create stronger bones. So this is bone remodeling, and I'm just going to quickly go over how the process works. So the blood cells come in, and the osteoclasts, they actually come and start to resorb or dissolve the bone. They do this because it's accessing the calcium. The calcium in the body is used for things like muscle action. You need calcium to be able to move your muscles. You also need calcium for your heart to beat. So if your body is lacking a little bit in the blood supply of calcium, it will turn to the bones to get it. Now, this resorption happens either way. It's always kind of recycling the calcium in the body. And then when the osteoblasts come back, they're going to start building the new bone, and then it mineralizes into the bone cells. So, little FYI, when we are in our 20s, our bodies are banking lots and lots of calcium into the bones. When we get to our 30s, it slows down. You can still be banking some of that calcium, but it's much slower deposit. And then once we hit our 40s, it becomes a maintenance mode. So knowing that we want to be encouraging that great nutrition, healthy weight-bearing exercises to help that bone health through into the older, later years. Okay, so for an assignment, please get some index cards, or you're welcome to just cut pieces of paper. There is a list. Please write each name of the bone on a separate index card or piece of paper, mix them up, and practice putting them into the layout of a full skeleton. So this is often the names of muscles have to do with the location that they are in the body or the bones in which they are connected to. So being familiar with some of those bones is going to help us know where some of the muscles are located. Practice naming each of the bones out loud as well. Okay, so feel free to pause the video here if you would like to just take note of where those different bones are actually throughout the body. You can use this to refer back to as you work on that index card assignment. All right, joints and movements. So there's going to be some more common major joints that we will look at in this training. So we get into 200-hour trainings and more in depth. We might look a little bit more at how some of the intricacies of some yoga poses can incorporate these different joints in smaller areas like the hands and the ankles and feet. So we're going to look at mainly our pivot, our hinge, and our ball and socket. Look at the hinge. So those are going to be just like a door. So we have the arms here at the elbow, the knees. Those are two of our major hinges. A lot of our fingers are going to work on hinging as well. But thinking about those major ones, so what about the knees? If we are using our flexion, sagittal movement, we can find the hinge joint in our chair pose. How about the arms? So again, we're looking at the hinging. So maybe back into our cobra pose and looking at that flexion in the arms. How about the hips? That's going to be a ball and socket. So lots more movement in the hip. So one pose that might get into that hip movement would be our Baddha Konasana. That is our external rotation. And remember, that was in the transverse planes of motion. And the shoulders. So the shoulders have the most mobility. They also are most susceptible to injury because they have less restriction. There's less bone holding them in place. It's a lot of ligaments and tendons that are holding that joint in place. So looking at some different movements here, we have eagle pose, placing one arm out, threading the other arm around, just noticing how that feels in the shoulders as you have that twisting, feeling the shoulder blades, maybe stretching. This is our eagle arms, and if that feels good, maybe taking it over on the other side and just evening it out. Seeing if you can keep the arms straight up and down. And then another pose that can really get into the shoulder joint, Gomukhasana, cow face pose. One arm reaches up and over, fingertips pointed down. The other arm, we do internal rotation and then point those fingers back up. So there's our Gomukhasana, and you can feel all the different twisting. And then if that feels good, take it over to the other side. So that's our ball and socket. How about pivot? So the spine is going to be one of the major joints that allows a lot of pivoting. So things like our supine spinal twist, taking the feet wider, the windshield wipers, soft little twist through the spine. Another, it's still the spine, but up in the head, so we can think about Warrior Two. Where are the eyes here? They're looking at those, past those fingertips of the front reaching arm. So a little rotation through the neck. And then think about some of those other joints that we might be using. The ankles, all the different ways that the ankles move, the hands, the wrists, the fingers and toes. Think about some of the yoga poses that you've practiced and see if you can find any poses that coordinate with those joint movements. Right, so bone assignment for when we all come together into our group practice. Practicing the names of the bones. You're going to report on a specific joint, the movement, and a yoga pose that uses that movement. You'll be teaching that in a small group setting. And your joint assignment will be in your email. Moving on to the muscles. All right, the anatomy of muscle. Just reviewing the structure, you can see over on the picture of the left, there's the bone way far back, and then there's the tendon, and then there's this sheath over top that kind of holds all of the muscle bundles together. And you can see that the muscle is a bundle made of bundles, made of bundles, made of bundles. So very, very in depth. If we go over to the right, that is the structure of one of those teeny tiniest little the myofilaments that it's pointing to, so the tiniest little strands. And if you see, there are these, they look like little sticks inside of I don't know. you can see it over here. And this is actually what creates the contraction. So when there's a chemical change throughout the tissue, this will become contracted and it will pull together. And all of the different filaments within the muscle bundles will work together and create the muscle contraction and then release it when we extend. Right, so blood supply. So there's type 1, slow twitch, and type 2, fast twitch. And I think blood supply is one of the bigger differences here. So the slow twitch, these are your workers. They're going to go all day for you. They're going to have a lot more of the blood capillaries, the mitochondria. They're going to feel, or they're going to get a lot more oxygen. They're usually a little bit smaller inside, and they're slow to fatigue. So if you're thinking about like the meat of a chicken, the slow twitch would be your dark meat. Very enriched with vessels. The type 2 fast twitch, this is going to have less of the blood supply. They're going to be larger in size, and they're going to be made for the quick motion. So for example, we have the gastrocnemius. That's that big one, especially with the hikers. You just see them like, oh, they're huge, right? Those are the powerhouses. That's going to be the fast twitch, and they are made for hard and fast. So, being able to jump. The muscle underneath of that, and we'll get to these in some of the anatomy videos, is called the soleus, and it lays underneath of those two muscles of the gastrocnemius. That is a slow twitch, and it works if you just practice walking nice and slow. You'll feel that deeper muscle working, and that is what helps us get through the entire day. Right, so origin and insertion. So basically this is the origin is where the anchor that the muscle will attach to, and the insertion is going to be where it attaches that will create the movement. So here we have this is the hip bone here. We have the femur, the leg bone, upper leg bone, and then down below the tibia. And you'll see that this connects all the way up into the hip and down by the knee and the tibia. Okay, so that will help. Think about how the muscles move. Again, we'll look a little bit deeper at this as we move through those later anatomy modules. And finally, just taking a look at muscle shapes and understanding that all of the muscles of the body, we saw that when we looked at the anatomy app, we had the full skeleton, and we saw many of those different shapes and directions and orientations and angles that these different muscles move on, and just understanding that there's going to be a different way of moving depending on how it connects. So something over here to the left, that would be something like doing your Popeye muscle, the biceps brachii. So this will just create that flexion, and you'll have this one single bulge of muscle, whereas maybe something that fans out a little more might have a little bit different ability to move. So let's just take a look. We saw in the origin and insertion the rectus femoris, and that's going to be this muscle straight down. We call them the quads, but that's a few different muscles, but the rectus femoris is the one straight in front. And if we think erectus, think erect, so something standing erect. Femoris, it's on the femur, so erect on the femur. Okay, so this is going to create, if we think about contracting it, it's going to extend the leg. I'm going to stretch it when I bend my knee, and then when I contract it, it's going to straighten my leg out. So if we are in our yoga poses, on our mountain pose, and we're going to create this, we have a soft bend in the knees, but we're going to start to contract. So I'm not going to like flex out my knees, but I'm going to start contracting that. And what's going to happen? My kneecaps are going to lift up. Notice how that brings this activation through the entire leg, because you're rooted in the ground, right? And you're not extending out or hyperextending the knees. You're keeping that micro bend in the knees. And so as you contract that, everything lights up. So that's a beginning of the understanding that yoga is not always this, letting everything go. It's a very active practice. It just looks to the outsider to be maybe, a little more like stretching. The pectoralis major, so that one was a converging muscle. One little point connects out here, but then it opened up and it connects deeper into the center of the chest. And so this is going to be like your butterflies. And if you really feel that, this is horizontal adduction. So that plane of motion, can you think of it? Which plane of motion is it? Transverse. Yeah, nice. And you can feel it. It's moving. Yes, we have a little bit up here, but you can feel it all through the chest because it's this converging muscle. All right, so that is the end of video 1 for anatomy. Please do all of the manual work, and there's those few assignments. Looking forward to seeing you at the next one.